An Ordinary Battalion at War, Episode 5, to Ypres. So the 2nd Battalion, the Essex Regiment, has been withdrawn from its positions on the Aisne on the 7th of October. The German efforts to attack towards Paris have been stopped, but French and British efforts to push them back have come to a bit of a stalemate, as the Germans and then the British and the French are digging entrenchments on the heights above the River Aisne. The next phase of the war is going to be an attempt by both sides to turn their enemy's flank, to find a position for manoeuvre where there aren't trenches. And this is going to lead to a campaign called the Race to the Sea. Now, there was fighting in Belgium already, in the area of Antwerp, but a series of outflanking manoeuvres are going to find the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, heading towards the old Belgian town of Ypres, to which it's going to become linked throughout history. For the 2nd Essex, they had been moved from their positions, as we said, on the 7th of October, being relieved by the French army. And on the 8th were given a warning order that on the next morning, the 9th of October, they were to parade at 9 a.m, ready to move off to a, at that time, unknown location, which was ultimately going to be Ypres. In a classic case of the British Army's hurry up and wait, they didn't actually leave until 7:50 on the 11th of October, and they started their journey on foot, but were ultimately going to end up in a fleet of motor buses and then on trains taking them to the north. They reached the town of Hasbrouck at 2 p.m. on the 12th of October and went into billets there for the night. And on the morning of the 13th of October, gunfire could be heard off in the southeast direction from the town, and this was the area which the 6th Division of the British Army was operating in. Now, German forces had only really disappeared out of the town of Hasbrouck a day or so beforehand, so the situation was quite uncertain and contact with the enemy was expected. And so the 4th Division move off to the east to try and attack towards where the enemy is believed to be. And the town that's going to be of importance on this day for the division, the brigade, and the 2nd Essex in particular is the town of Meteren. Now, from Hasbrouck, the 2nd Essex leave at 9:15 on the morning of the 13th, and they find themselves marching to their east and ended up in a position, and apologies for the pronunciation already, Red Cross, which is just to the south of Meteren, which is marked on this map. And ultimately, the division's target is to attack and take Meteren and the ground to its north. And there's a slight ridge there, and with the topography of the area, it's quite a flat area, that any kind of high ground is going to have strategic importance. And with a village there that's potentially been fortified by the Germans, there's a clear need for the division to get onto that ground and clear them away. So basically, the division is going to attack from the direction of Meteren towards Meteren, and for the 12th Brigade, their target is to take the town of Meteren and the ground to its north, which is slightly elevated ground. And so in this screenshot, we see some ground that the battalion will be advancing over, and Meteren Beke, which is some sort of river, that is an area that's going to become quite important. Shifting now to a map taken from the regimental history by Burroughs, we can pick up the story. And we said that the battalion had marched out of Hasbrouck at 9:15 and they reached the area Red Cross at about 10 a.m. on the morning of the 13th. They're here for a couple of hours before they receive the formal orders around midday, maybe 1 p.m. in the afternoon, that the division and particularly the brigade is going to attack towards Meteren and seize the ground to its north as well. Intelligence suggests that the enemy in the area are formed out of units from the 3rd Cavalry Division, the 6th Bavarian Division, but it's also believed that there are 4 Jaeger battalions, and some artillery in the area. So when the plan of attack has been sort of given down to the troops, the 12th Brigade puts two battalions into the attack. The 2nd Essex being the north or left hand as we look at it from the point of view of the attack, and the King's Own being the southern or right hand battalion. And the axis between them is going to be the road from Red Cross towards Meteren. They are in turn supported by the Inniskilling Fusiliers and the Lancashire Fusiliers. And the idea is that the 10th Brigade has sent some troops into the area already, including a battalion in the Warwickshires, and there's also going to be attacks further to the south as well. So the battalion starts to move forward and finds itself moving across this open ground. And I'm going to switch now to the account given in Burroughs' regimental history, because I think it gives us quite a good picture of what was going on. The Essex approached the position in artillery formation, 2 companies in the front line and 2 in support, and at 2:30 p.m. they reached a group of cottages on the main road near Les Ormes. The leading companies were ordered to extend on the north side of the road. Coming out of the shelter of the cottages, the men were met with heavy enfilade fire from machine guns, which were difficult to locate owing to the heavy rain and fog. The guns were believed to be posted in Meteren Church, which stood in clear outline on the hilltop. Their fire did not do much hurt, for most of it whizzed harmlessly over their heads. The Warwickshires, part of the advance guard, which early in the day had been supplied by the 10th Brigade, had already reached some buildings at the foot of the hill upon which Meteren stands. And I'm going to switch you now to a drawing from the regimental history showing some of the ground over which the battalion advanced. The leading Essex companies came up level with them, and that's the Warwickshires, and at about 3:30 p.m. a 3rd company was also pushed forward from the support line. The 4th company, later being used by Major Tufnell, who was acting as the commander of the battalion at the time, that's like sort of my own personal footnote to add there, to prolong the line on the left. To perform this manoeuvre, the 4th company had to proceed a couple of hundred yards to the left, which was accomplished by turning the men of the extended lines into file and marching across the front. Such a performance, wrote an officer, would have driven umpires at manoeuvres frantic. We carried out the movement unscathed, however, though there was heavy machine gun fire passing overhead. Apparently the Germans could not depress their guns sufficiently to catch us. Now, having reached this position, and this is breaking away from the regimental history now, the battalion is concerned about crossing the ground that we can see in this drawing here. And they describe it as being like a glacier. It's totally open. There's one hedge running diagonally across, and it's overlooked by a series of buildings. I'm going to take you now back to Google Maps or Google Earth, and this short video should give us a bit of a feel for the ground over which they were going to be advancing. And one of the landmarks that's been mentioned a number of times in these accounts is Meteren Church, which we can now see on the screen there. Which is obviously quite a distinctive landmark, and from which you'll remember it was believed that the fire of the German guns was being directed. So the King's Own are meant to take the town of Meteren, and the 2nd Essex are going to be working on the ground to the north of the town, which is to the left of the screen that we can see now. And I found online this rather romanticised image of the English of the assault of the village from the 13th of October 1914. But if we return to the 2nd Essex and their adventures, we can pick it up again using Burroughs' regimental history as one of our main crib sheets. The prospect of a successful attack did not appear promising, for 300 yards of glacier-like slope had to be crossed, serrated by a long hedge running diagonally across the front. A large farm building lay near the crest. The brigade was without artillery support. The enemy was not visible, but the fire from the hedge was fairly heavy. As the leading platoons climbed out of the beck to again push forwards, the Seaforth Highlanders came up on the left, prolonging the line and probably overlapping the enemy's right. The German fire slackened, and the impulse to go ahead came suddenly. The extended line surged forward, and in a few minutes the Essex were through the hedge and pushing up the hill. A few Jaegers were captured in the farm building. 3 of them, armed, were taken by Company Sergeant Major Tippler with an empty rifle. The thick hedges of the slopes caused some confusion, and on reaching what appeared to be the top of the hill, it was found to be a false crest, and it was necessary to reorganise the companies and move still further forward. Heavy firing on the right revealed that Meteren was still occupied, and darkness was fast approaching. The battalion bivouacked for the night on the ground it had gained, pushing forward entrenched outpost companies. 2 small and apparently deserted farmhouses lay in the vicinity. Cries of "Anglaise" by the troops produced sudden movement. Lights were kindled, and the buildings were found to be crowded with frightened inhabitants. Their joy was unbounded at their deliverance, and they brewed all the coffee they possessed for the good cheer of their deliverers. Now, even the regimental history, which is obviously going to look favourably upon the actions of the 2nd Essex, says that they were lucky because of the ground that they were having to cross. And the King's Own on their right, which you'll remember was to the other side of the road, had suffered considerably during this advance. However, it was clearly not necessarily the easy attack that the regimental history perhaps suggests, because in research we found that there was 2 Distinguished Conduct Medals awarded for the fighting on this day. Sergeant Hodge, as you can see here, although wounded through the shoulder, continued in command of his platoon and led it forward to the firing line, potentially to that beck that we talked about. And then we have Acting Company Quartermaster Sergeant J. Barton for leading his platoon in a conspicuously gallant manner on 13th October when in independent command. And I think it's an interesting point that both of these, a sergeant and a company quartermaster sergeant, are referred to as leading their platoons. And so it perhaps is a sign of the casualties that the battalion has already taken in the actions it's done so far, and the turnover amongst the officers of the battalion. Now, the regimental history says that 4 Essex soldiers, 4 other ranks were killed during this action, but my research would suggest that there was actually 5, so 4 killed and 21 wounded according to the regimental history. But using the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database, it identifies that there are 5 soldiers that died on this day, with a couple more dying of wounds the next day. And one of the things that I've kind of looked at in my research into the 2nd Battalion of the Essex Regiment is I looked at the 1914 medal roll, which gives us details of who was awarded the 14 star. Now, to get this medal, you had to be over in France and Flanders before, I think it's the 21st of November 1914. And so the paperwork that's associated with that thing called the medal rolls tells us when the soldiers went overseas. And of the 5 casualties that we see listed here, Private Smith, H. Smith, he had actually gone over on the 24th of August, whereas the majority of the battalion had set overseas on the 22nd. Private William Shaw was actually one of the originals, the 22nd. Private Payne, he was actually taken on strength of the battalion on the 31st of August, so a bit later. Private Everett was one of the originals, and Lance Corporal Gordon was also one of the originals. And we can see from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission data that there is entries here for Shaw saying that he's from Walthamstow, which, whilst technically London is like where London and Essex connect, and we can also see that Everett was actually kind of properly from Essex, from Kelvedon. But soldiers died in the Great War also lists where soldiers were born, where they enlisted, and where they resided. And the data from the others show that they do have connections to the Essex Regiment. And this is something that we'll follow through in our story and see if that's true as the war develops. So the battalion has taken the ground that it needed to. It's on the high ground to the north of Meteren. The King's Own will ultimately clear Meteren as a town and take it, with some assistance from some other units. But the attack was successful at what, for First World War standards, was probably quite a low cost. I want to quickly reference another casualty of that day. It was mentioned that the Warwickshires had been pushed forward as the advance guard, and that the Essex kind of advanced up behind those for part of the battle. One of the officers that was wounded in this action was an officer, Montgomery, Lieutenant Montgomery, Bernard Law Montgomery, who was shot through the chest during the attack on Meteren and was laying out in a sort of an uncovered position. A soldier came forward to try and give him some basic first aid, and whilst doing so was himself shot and killed. And Lieutenant Montgomery laid out on the battlefield for a number of hours, receiving another wound to his leg because Germans were shooting at him and the soldier that was dead across his body. Now, this Lieutenant Montgomery was very badly injured, gunshot wound to the chest, gunshot wound to the leg, and was ultimately evacuated, possibly delayed, depending on which accounts that you talk to, because it wasn't believed that he would survive. But he did, and as I'm sure many of you watching this will already have worked out, this is Field Marshal Viscount Montgomery of Alamein, more famous from the Second World War. So, with the 2nd Essex on the high ground to the north of Meteren, having seized the objective that they were given on the 13th of October 1914, they will soon find themselves repositioned and sent further north into Ypres and into a position called Plug Street Wood. And that will be the next episode.